Okay, this week we're talking about another approach to argumentation, which is looking at argumentation from an ethical perspective. And anytime we start talking about this thing, ethics, we run into some trouble, in part because we have sometimes, often, between us, disagreements over, right, like what ethics even actually is, right? Not over so much the idea of ethics, right, but the brass tacks, the hardcore issues. We don't have anybody who says, hey, you're right, you're wrong, end of the debate, right? Which means we're always going to have a certain level of disagreement. And this is undoubtedly true, and it's a problem that we have to address whenever we're talking about ethics. But it's important to be aware of what kind of problem this is and exactly what the implications of this question are, because this is ultimately an epistemological question. How do we know who is right and who is wrong when we have a disagreement over ethical questions? And the implications of this are really important. It means that we have to accept a certain degree of error, we have to accept a possibility of disagreement, and that those are things that we're never going to have kind of the ability to say, hey, everyone agrees absolutely without a doubt this is a case of an ethical wrong. And even if we can on some core issues get a huge amount of consensus, on other issues we're going to have a significant amount of divergent opinions, right? Now, that is something that we who deal with arguments are really used to, right? Okay, because, hey, we're consistent. That's what we do, is operate in the realm of areas where there's a certain amount of disagreement. But also, the fact of the matter is that argument itself, just by engaging in argument, assumes certain things as having kind of values that we can refer back to, that we have consensus on, even if we have disagreement over some ethical questions, right? Like, to argue with somebody means that, we're going to value reason, we're going to value equality, we're going to value the absence of coercion, okay? If I don't feel like you're my equal, if I don't believe that you're amenable to reason, and I believe I have a right to use force to get you to do what I want to do, then why would I argue with you at all, right? Okay? So there we go. These are certain assumptions, and so they give us places that we can go to when we're starting to talk about ethics. Like those things like, thou shalt not kill, right? That seem to be pretty universal across kind of cultural and temporal situations, and then also those kind of values that are embedded in the nature of argument. So we do have some things that we can go to and build an ethical theory on, but it is not an implication of this kind of ethical uncertainty to say that, nothing at all can be said to be ethical. That, you have your ethics and I have mine, and if we disagree, well, there's no kind of, two ships passing in the night. There's no basis for us to come to any agreement. I don't think that that's true. I don't think it's assumed at all by the willingness to recognize a certain amount of possibility of error and disagreement. Does not warrant or legitimize, on the other hand, the idea that there's no such thing. Anyway, let me show you what I mean, right? Here. The first is that, what you're trying to do when you say, because you can't say for certain what is and is not ethical, that there's no such thing as the ethical and unethical, then what you've done is you've drawn a conclusion about ontological, what is, and axiological, what's good, what's bad, kind of statements from an epistemological claim, right? A claim about epistemology deriving conclusions ontologically or axiologically. But, you see, you can't prove an ontological claim or an axiological claim with an epistemological statement, right? Because those things assume one another. They don't prove one another, right? Epistemological claims assume certain axiological implications. Axiological statements assume certain epistemological implications, both of which assume certain ontological implications, right? These things mutually reinforce one another. One of them can't be used as the basis for assuming another. That's just straight up question begging. Also, we should understand that, with things like science, right, with science we accept a certain level, a certain amount of doubt, an ineliminable element of subjectivity kind of all of the time, right? Scientists don't express the level of certainty over gravity that we express over certain values like equality, liberty, freedom, right? Like those things we seem to be able to assert as though they can be asserted fairly confidently, right? We assert them with far more confidence than scientists assert things like the law of natural selection, and those are things that, we've really kind of established with tons and tons and tons of empirical evidence, right? So, I think that if scientists can accept that certain ineliminable element of doubt, we certainly can when we're talking about ethical considerations as well. On a practical level, though, we also have to recognize the fact that we can and do make judgments, right? And ethical judgments, and we make them all the time. We make them as individuals in our daily lives, and we make choices about what we will and will not do. We make them as societies when we make the decision about what we're going to fund, what we're going to defund, what we're going to value, what we're going to criminalize, what we're going to legalize, right? Those are all questions that have certain ethical components to them. And unless you want to live in a society of absolute and total anarchism, right, where it's, the war of all against all and nobody can tell anybody what they're doing is right and nobody can tell anybody what they're doing is wrong, well, right, then you have to accept some level of kind of imposition of one vision of what's right and just and fair and good on one person by other people. So, we have a theoretical problem, okay, which is kind of like, how do we know what's right and what's wrong? How do we know what our ethical standards are? We also then have a practical problem that comes from that, right? So what do we do? These are issues that are going to always come up when we're related to ethics, right? Sometimes we'll recognize something as an ethical wrong, and then our answer will be like, okay, what do we do about it now? And we'll have to say, no. I haven't got necessarily a very good idea on that yet, maybe, right? But as a people who are engaged in argument, we should be okay with this. We should be comfortable with this certain degree of overlap and argument between us. Okay. One thing that may help us to kind of rationalize this kind of fact and to kind of grapple with it is to recognize that trying to argue about what is good and what is bad sometimes is unproductive. And often we find ourselves in a situation where it's a lot easier and more productive of us to think about what's better in a given situation and what's worse in a given situation and why, rather than to try to find these big, large-scale kinds of things. So what I guess I'm saying is that when it comes to the difference between a theoretical issue and a practical issue, let's try to focus as much as we can on the practical issues rather than on the big theory ones. All right. The other issue I want to talk about before we get too far into this is kind of making a distinction here between ethics on one hand and ethics of argument on another. Let me see if I can help clarify this distinction for you. Okay? We're talking about the ethics of the argument. We're talking about the ethics of the argument itself, its structure, its format, the way it's developed, what it assumes, what it doesn't assume, all of those things that are about arguments. And the ethics of what's argued for, right, that's the subject matter, right? So if I argue, for example, right, if I'm going to make the argument, that there should be almost no restrictions on speech in the United States, the way John Stuart Mill did, he's actually arguing about Britain, but let's say U.S., right? I'm going to argue that there should be no restrictions. We have that idea, right? Okay, that thing that I'm arguing for, freedom of speech, and we can talk about whether or not that's good or bad. But we can also talk about the types of arguments that I used when I argued in favor of freedom of speech. What are the forms of those arguments? What are the structures of those arguments? What are the functions of those arguments? How are they arranged, right? Are they sound arguments? Are they manipulative arguments, right? That's a fundamentally different question, okay, as we'll see. Let me see if I can kind of walk you through some of these issues. So, one way that we can talk about arguments, or we can criticize arguments, or evaluate arguments on an ethical level, is we can talk about what's argued for, right? And we can basically say, listen, if you're arguing for something ethical, then you've got an ethical argument. If you're arguing against something ethical, then you have an unethical argument. Or for something unethical, then you have an unethical argument, right? And there's two basic ways that we can go about it. And this is not a class in ethics, so these are real broad perspectives. I encourage you and invite you to bring in other ethical perspectives when you're looking at this, but we can broadly look at ethical theories in two ways. We can call them deontological, and we can call them consequential. Okay, so let's talk about deontological ethics first, right? Deontological ethics is this approach to ethics which says, hey, right and wrong are categorical, right? That is, they apply to all of the things. They are distributed across members of a class, right? Okay, and that what makes something right or wrong is not a hypothetical question, not a what-if question, not a if we do this, this is what might or probably or could happen, and we'll decide our ethics based on that kind of question, but rather, no, right and wrong are intrinsic to the acts themselves, not extrinsic based on what those actions accomplished. Okay, so think about it this way, right? One of the things that as a deontological critic you might be really interested in when you're evaluating arguments is something like lying, right? Because, if we're arguing, and let's say we're arguing for something that we believe in, but we're using evidence that we know to be false, or we're telling you that sources that we know to be suspect are in fact really credible, right? Or we're using deliberative or misleading techniques, right? Deceptive or misleading techniques. Okay, lying, right? Now that's something that as a deontological ethicist who's interested in argument, you ought to be concerned with, right? So lying from a deontological perspective is something that is always wrong. Right? Okay, so if we look at, that's the nature of it. They are wrong. That's what There's no good. There's no okay lies. There's no noble lies, right? There are things that are wrong, right? Okay, there you go. And so this issue is not an issue anymore. We're not going to talk about whether or not a lie is good. Instead, what we're going to talk about is really whether or not this text that we're looking at, the sample, the argument that we're analyzing, does that involve lying, right? Is the arguer lying? Not is lying right or wrong, not is lying justified. The answer to that is wrong and no. Okay, the answer and the only relevant question is now, is it a lie? And so we're going to be really concerned as deontologists, right, with defining what a lie is and then looking for those criteria or differentiae as we're examining the text, right? So, for example, right, one definition of lying that I think is really is that you have to say something that's untrue, you have to know it's untrue, there's a difference between lying and making a mistake, right? Okay, the conditions under which it's said have to be ones in which there's an expectation of the truth. When I go to the theater and I see Shakespeare, I don't think that the actor on stage is lying to me, I think he's entertaining me, right? Okay, and there has to be this acknowledged right, okay, to the truth. So you can't hold me accountable for what I say when a gun is to my head, for example, right? Because there's no expectation that you have a right to the truth while you're coercing me with a gun. You have a right to get me to say whatever I will say to stay alive, perhaps, but you don't have the right to the truth, right? So we're going to look at those conditions and say, do they apply to our text? If they do, then we have a situation in which the person is lying, and the lying makes it unethical. There we go. So it's a really nice way that we can use this deontological method to study and question the ethics of a particular mode or type of argument. So, in addition to lying, and lying is just one of the things that we might look at as a deontologist, we also might talk about things like adherence to the law or normative standards of justice. We could talk about adherence to values like equality. But what we're looking for are those duties, right? Those responsibilities, those things that as a speaker you have to do, right? Okay. But we're also looking for those injunctions, those prohibitions, those sanctions, right? That you cannot do these things, all right? You cannot lie. You cannot resort to the use of or threaten violence as part of your argument, for example. Like, those are things that we could talk about as being sort of ethical standards that we could hold up and measure against an argument to see whether or not it's ethical. So, all right. Of these two approaches, we can also talk about consequentialist kind of ethics. And these are those hypothetical what-if questions. If I do this, what is the likely consequence, the likely result of that? And if that likely consequence or result is good, then that is what I should do. If it's bad, then I should not do it, right? Okay, so in this case, whether or not we lie isn't a question of saying, are lies always good or are lies always bad, right? But rather a question of saying, in this particular case, what interest is served by telling a lie or by doing something that, under other circumstances, someone might say from a deontological perspective is wrong. So the idea would be is if the outcome is good, and Mills, who's a big proponent of this particular view, those of you who remember your John Stuart Mill, if the outcome is good, by which he means useful, practical, then the end was good. Now this, though, does lead us into a little bit of a problem, right? Because it can put us into a situation where, right, that when we're looking at every single act on a case-by-case basis to ask whether or not it's good, it doesn't ever really answer our fundamental question, right, of what do we do, that practical level of applied ethics that we're interested in this sort of class. But more importantly, it really does kind of put us in this question of saying that, any act is any act justified as long as the ends are justified? Do the ends always justify the means? That seems to me to be a pretty kind of scary, dangerous sort of argument to begin advancing when it comes to ethics. And really so do people like John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was never, we call an act utilitarian, who thought that we measure acts by whether or not they're utile or not. He was a rule utilitarian. Right? So the idea would be more that we can come up with ethical principles, like whether or not it's okay to lie, whether or not it's okay to threaten violence, whether or not it's okay whether or not you have to assume the equality of people that you're arguing with, right? Like those kinds of things, the same sort of thing that the deontologists come up with. They're saying, listen, you could get those kind of things by looking at the consequences of those particular principles. Not on a case-by-case basis of the act, but on whether or not there's a general rule, right? So with a case to a lie, we could say, hey, listen, let's not look at it and see what the consequences would be, if Jim lied in a particular situation, But let's look at it and say, hey, would we be willing to take his arguments, his reasons for lying, and say anybody who has those same reasons, that those people should also be allowed to lie? If so, right, then we have a general rule that we can operate under, right? Like perhaps it's okay to lie if doing so would save people's lives, or it's okay to break the law if doing so results in the development of more just and fair laws, right? That does not mean that, right, everyone who wants to break the law can break the law because they don't like it. It means that you have to break it, or can only break it ethically and morally under particular circumstances. And that's the difference from what we call act utilitarianism, which only wants to look at acts, and rule utilitarians, which look at acts as though, if this was the rule, would the rule be ethical in the sense that the rule would have good or bad consequences. So the consequentialist is going to look at things from a slightly different point of view than the deontologist, but they're going to look at a lot of the same kinds of factors, right? So what kinds of rules should we be looking at? How do we frame rules? What are the values? What are the principles? What are the objectives that we ought to be targeting rules at when we're going about making them? But also, how do we respond to or how do we address certain conflicts within the rules, right? What happens when we have, for example, two rules really that collide with one another? Okay, can we say that there's a never circumstance under which it's okay to steal from your employer? Because right? Are we really prepared to say that just because we don't want it to be a rule that this particular case maybe wouldn't be ethically justified, right? Like, how do we deal with those apparent conflicts? And this is where things like, saying and speaking out against things that a lot of people believe in, but maybe you disagree with. It's about a lot of things like, for example, civil disobedience, or, strategic refusal to obey the law, like all kinds of things like that are really important issues and that we want to talk about. And consequentialism has to really think about those in ways that deontologists don't necessarily have to. So, for example, when we're looking and asking about it, questions of ethical consideration or ethical criticism, we might think about the case of Daniel Ellsberg, right? From your readings and from your activities, this is the guy who, signed an agreement, made a promise. Those are big deals for deontologists, right? Okay, deontologists care about things like promise keeping. And he promised he wouldn't share that information with other people. But then when he read it and realized what it was, he's like, oh my gosh, I have to share this with people, right? So we've got an issue here maybe of conflicting duties. The duty to keep your promises, the duty to obey the law, the duty to stand up for what you believe is right. Okay, all of those are issues that a deontological critic would be interested in when they're considering the actions of Daniel Ellsberg. The consequentialist would be looking at other things, right? The consequentialist would be looking at things like, what was the end result, right? As a result of releasing these papers, what happened? Did he hasten bring about the end of the war in Vietnam and thereby save, potentially thousands and thousands of lives? Okay, well then that seems to me like if it would save lives, then breaking your promise is warranted. That seems like it's interesting, right? Like that might be the kinds of questions that we would ask if we were going to be a consequentialist critic and we're looking at the actions of Daniel Ellsberg in this particular case. Now, in this case, though, really, and we come down to maybe looking at certain kind of things that people are doing or strategies that they're employing in the argument, but when it comes down to it, often what we find ourselves getting sucked into in these kinds of discussions and these kinds of debates is not really about arguments, but about what is being argued for, right? So, we tend to be looking at them and saying, hey, listen, I support the Vietnam War. I think the Vietnam War was an ethical war. I think the Vietnam War was a good war. Therefore, what Daniel Ellsberg did to end that war was bad, right? And, the counter-argument being, it was an illegal war, it was an immoral war, it was an impractical war, and therefore ending it was good. Therefore, what Ellsberg did was good. And so what we're really doing there is we're not talking about arguments. We're talking about ethics generally, which is a realm where the philosophers play. Now, Aristotle points out, right, that ethics, politics, and dialectic, argument, are all intersecting ideas. There's no way to really fully pull these things apart from one another. But the theory of ethics that I'm going to kind of move to at this point, right, is going to call for a kind of different way of looking at it, right? So, like, for example, okay, there's Hitler here, right? And what I'm suggesting is that, another way to look at arguments, another way to look at the ethics of argument, is to see if we can't pull apart, like, what he argued for on one hand, which, of course, most people are going to say is unethical, and then look at how he argued for it. And is it possible that they can have a different ethical appeal? The same thing would apply the other way too, right? We take somebody who we generally think argued for really good, moral, virtuous things, like Martin Luther King Jr., and is it possible, is it even remotely possible, what we're asking, that he maybe used unethical arguments to argue for a good thing? Because if it's possible, if we can bifurcate these kind of things, then we have that space where really those of us who study argument, what we're really going to be interested in, what we're really going to be interested in, I think, folks, is going to be these things here. Like, that's where we're going to ask our ethical questions. Leave these ones up here, right? Leave these ones up here to the philosophers. We're interested in these ones. We're interested in that how. And I think that's really what's going to be crucial for us, and that's really where I think argumentation study can really apply itself. And we're looking not at the ethics of what's argued for, but the ethics of the argument itself. How it's argued. Now, if we're going to talk about how something's argued and whether or not something is argued ethically, that means our first step is always going to be a description of the argument, right? If we can't describe arguments, then we can't talk about how ethical they are. So notice how ethical evaluation of arguments, just like the logical evaluation of arguments, just like the narrative evaluation of arguments, these kinds of evaluations of arguments also have to begin with a good description. Once we have a good description, then we can move to kind of making judgments about the arguments. And in this case, what I'm going to put forward is a critical theory of arguments. Arguments from a critical theoretical perspective. And in part, this is drawing a lot on the work of this guy right here, who writes actually in terms of pedagogy. His name is Paulo Freire, right? He writes a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which you may have come across in some of your other classes, right? But Freire is talking about pedagogy or education, right? And he's talking about an approach to education, and he says, listen, there's two things that you can do, right, with education. There's two goals towards which education can be aimed. It can be aimed at liberation, right, which is making people more educated, more able to control their own lives, more able to participate in democratic mechanisms, more able to advocate for their own interests, more able to articulate their own needs, more able to express themselves, or the opposite of that, which is what he calls the rhetoric of domestication. This is making a people a passive people, making people, people who are led rather than a people who lead, right? This kind of big difference between the two. And this is what he kind of advances sort of as his standard for good pedagogy, liberation, and bad code pedagogy, domination. And these are really the approach that I'm taking here to what I'm calling a critical theory of ethics, in the sense that arguments can either move us towards liberation or arguments can move us towards domestication. And building largely on the work of a person named Plato, who wrote about a guy named Socrates, as interpreted, several thousand years later by a guy named Weaver, and then reanalyzed right, and for Ute here, okay, is a theory of this ethics, and I think how this kind of plays out and what we're looking for when we're trying to apply this critical theory of ethics that I'm referring to. So Socrates, and Socrates is kind of the genesis of this idea. He's the guy who's telling us sort of where we get these ideas of what is good and what is bad when it comes to arguments. And he does this in a very convoluted way, right? He does it in a narrative style. He tells a story. And in his story, there's a young man named Phaedrus. And Phaedrus is interested in who he should take kind of as his partner, right? Like, who should he pair up with kind of in a romantic way? And he's just been given an argument about why he should look for somebody who is really, a kind of practical choice. And Socrates then confronts him with two other possibilities, right? He says, no, there's also the evil possibility, the possibility that you might go to a person who's really bad for you. And then there's the good choice, the person who's really, really good for you. Right? So we kind of lay out. From this, he says, listen, there's three really basic things that you can get from a romantic relationship. But when Plato's talking about, love, what he's really talking about is argument. He talks about it as writing in code, but we could talk about it as writing in metaphor, right? And the metaphor is he's using love and romantic relationships as a metaphor for argument, right? Okay, and so what he's saying here is that there's three different ways that an argument can move us, right? It can move us first, nowhere. Right? It can just have no effect on us, right? And that's great. And honestly, to a certain degree, there's a lot of us that I really like this as an option. It's super practical, right? Now, I mean, I want you to think about it first and what Plato's saying about love first. And what Plato's saying about love is this idea of, hey, there's all kinds of people that, you could, end up in a romantic relationship with. But, as you're looking for long-term romantic relationships, maybe a little more of this and a little less of this, right? Maybe somebody who's going to all of their classes and passing all of their classes and has a future ahead of them, but maybe doesn't quite have the same, right? So if you have to choose between the head and the heart, what he's suggesting here, we choose our head, right? Much of how we learn writing and how we learn, communication is based around this idea, right, of being useful, okay, of being really pragmatic, like how to express our ideas clearly, not demonstrate why our ideas are necessarily good ideas, right, but just be clear about our ideas. Okay, this very, very pragmatic, very useful, very separated, objective, divorced from our passions kinds of going about doing it. Okay, and this is the idea of writing or arguing from a perspective where we're trying not to really influence the other person in any way. Right? This is somebody who says, hey, I'm not trying to influence you. I'm just trying to share with you what I believe. I don't want you to be changed. This is just, right? Okay, very good. This kind of arguer, by the way, would be an approach to argument that says, I'm going to write all the arguments for something on one side, and then all the arguments against it on the other side, and then just let you choose which of them you think is the better argument, right? I'm a neutral kind of conveyor of information here, not really an arguer per se. Now, Socrates is very skeptical of this, right? Socrates says, well, if you have no real interest in which side of the equation I come down on, why are you spending all of this time writing out the equation for us, right? Why are you giving me arguments if it doesn't really matter to you what side it is that I come down on? And Socrates says, I think it does matter what side. But let's say hypothetically it doesn't. Let's say you really are as neutral as you purport to be. Okay, that's one way where we can talk about it. And there's certainly people who are going to argue that that's what makes a person ethical, is this degree of neutrality. That's not what Socrates says. Right? He says, first of all, the idea of neutrality is speculative, right? The idea that somebody could actually be neutral, that's doubtful, for one thing, right? Okay, but, if that's so, and if that's our goal, if that's what we're after, is a neutral kind of thing, then how do we make moral judgments about things like lying, right? If lying could be good or could be bad, right? Well, how do we stand on that, right? Because that's an issue. If I'm going to try to make an argument in the public sphere, if I'm going to try and convince people or persuade people or say things, that are going to influence the way other people think, how do I use this particular perspective? Or is it always wrong when I try to influence or shape other people's perspective? So this neutral perspective leaves us, I think, in a little bit of a quandary, right? It doesn't know how to answer questions about, like, for example, noble or virtuous lies, or when it's okay to engage in civil disobedience. So the next type of lover or arguer that Socrates wants to talk about is the base or the evil lover. And this is the kind of person who is motivated, by their own self-interest without real consideration for the other person that's involved. I always think of Socrates' description of the evil lover as kind of like that parent, okay, who lives vicariously through their child involved in sports, right? Who's not interested in the emotional health or the physical well-being or the long-term educational interest of their child. They just want somebody to be really, really good at blah, 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 right? That kind of like driven to the point where what they're doing, can almost look like it's really healthy or good for the kid. And certain people will want to believe that it's good and healthy for the kid, versus, that kind of like genuine concern for the overall well-being of your child, right? So if you're teaching your child to win at all costs, but to be a really, terrible competitor, to have no sense of sportsmanship involved in the game at all, then you're raising your kid to be a jerk, right? Is that really, okay? So the health benefits, the physical benefits, those don't matter, right? Because you're kind of like, no, I want my kid to be a winner, and I have to win at all costs. Well, you're raising a fundamentally bad human being then, I think, right? Okay. But for Socrates, the concern is kind of like the idea of creating a weak individual, right? And he really lays out, those of you who've never read it, he lays out kind of the formula for an abusive relationship, in which he says, listen, here's what, an abusive kind of love does, right? An abusive love doesn't want you to ever feel like you're smart enough. It doesn't want you to be able to stand on your own 2 feet. It doesn't want you to have any confidence or self-esteem. Why? Because if you have all of those things, you might leave, right? Okay, that kind of idea, that kind of keeping people weak. That's what he says is the worst thing that you can do, is make people, in the sense of what he says, dependent upon you, right? And I want you to think about that. I want you to think about the difference between a parent who raises their children to be independent versus a parent who raises their children to always need to rely on them for literally everything, unable to function as independent grown-up adults in the real world, right? And that's what he is saying is unethical. That, for Socrates, is like the worst thing you can do to a person, because it kind of turns them into your servant or your slave. It also really fits, into very neatly Paulo Freire's definition of an unjust or a bad or an evil pedagogy, what he calls the pedagogy of domestication, I talked about before, right? But here's the great line from Socrates here. He says, as wolves love sheep, so do base lovers love their loves, right? Okay, they don't love them as independent, strong human beings. They love them as objects of control that they can kind of feed off of to make themselves feel better. That's a really horrible, nasty kind of thing. Socrates says, wait, though, wait. There's another kind of love, though, that's really, really important that we want to talk about, and that is what he calls the noble or virtuous love, the love that is really centered on the other person and their overall well-being. This is love really not for any one particular person, but for kind of the intrinsic values of that person, right? The intrinsic humanity, the goodness, the rightness, the justice that makes them part of that, right? We could talk about, because you and I live in the same political system, we live in the same polis, our outcomes, our fates are tied together in so many ways. You are objectively valuable. That's really where this kind of notion of critical ethics begins, is recognizing the objective value of the other person, right? In the same way, what a parent really wants is what's best for the child, even if it's not necessarily the best for themselves, right? That's that kind of sense what the Christians called agape, right? Based on the Greek idea of a kind of selfless kind of love, right? A love that wants the other person to be better, okay? And in this, and here is where I think Socrates is really clear, and it becomes really kind of visible that he's not talking about love, but talking about arguments, right? And he lays out these things that a lover who really is the noble or virtuous lover would do, and what they would do to a person to make them a stronger, better person. And I'm going to kind of summarize those and make them really obvious for you kind of here now, right? The first is he says, listen, okay, in an argument, I want you to think about an arguer that makes their evidence visible, right? Here's where I got my information. Here's where my sources came from. Here's where my facts are come from, right? Now, not only is that argument well supported, so I should be able to count on it, I should be able to trust its accuracy. If I'm telling you where I'm getting my information, that gives you that opportunity to go and learn, more about it yourself, right? So you could actually become more knowledgeable about the subject than I am. Okay, all right. Also, you could go back and you could check me, right? It gives me to say, hey, it's not me. This is not my opinion. It's not me trying to manipulate you. Here are the facts. If you don't go believe me, check them out yourself, right? That is this empowering kind of move. That's why it's important for us to cite sources in our speeches, to tell people where our information is coming from, because it gives them that opportunity to respond to it, to check it, not to just take our word for it, okay? And that's the difference between liberation and domestication, which just says, hey, here's the information, take it or leave it. You don't have the ability to critique it or question it. Okay? So, when we give audiences, when we give our auditors, our interlocutors, the people with whom we're arguing, the sources, we enable them to be critical thinkers, we give them the tools to think critically with, and we empower them or make possibility their abilities to be critical thinkers. And that is how the ethical implications of this idea of evidence, right, and how it fits in with that idea of arguments for liberation rather than domestication. In the same way that we want to make our evidence open and accessible, we want our reasoning to be intelligible. We want it to be sound. There are going to be times when skipping a bunch of logical steps and just getting to the conclusion might be more persuasive, right? there are times when really simple, kind of dumbed down versions of events really are easier for us to swallow. They're easiest for us to digest. They're easier for us to process. Let's give like simple little 2-minute versions of the argument rather than treating the subject in the depth that it really deserves. Okay, right. But if you're not going to see my reasoning, right, then how can you actually process whether or not it's a good argument? I mean, effectively, if I'm not going to show you my logical steps, if I'm not going to show you in my argument how I moved from the data through the hypothetical syllogisms, my lines of argument, my coordinate and compound arguments, show you how I got from the data to the conclusions, then how can you check that argument? And if you can't see the argument, if you can't evaluate it yourself, then what you're really being asked to do is just accept the argument's validity on my authority, right? Like, I did the reasoning, I did the work, just accept my argument. You don't have to check up on it, right? Okay? And that's the idea. Now, in this case, it doesn't really matter if I'm intentionally distorting arguments, right? If I'm intentionally warping them around. But the fact of the matter is how do you know I am not distorting the arguments? How can you tell whether or not this genuinely is the stronger case? And in this case, folks, it doesn't matter. It's not about whether or not I'm actually making a weak argument look like a strong argument. What matters is I'm not allowing you the opportunity as an auditor, as an interlocutor, as a fellow arguer, the opportunity to access my argument and to evaluate my argument. I'm telling you, accept it. It's a take it or leave it kind of thing. And that is a rhetoric or an argument of domestication and not of liberation. So, in this case, if we do not share our evidence, we do not share our reasoning, what we're really doing is we're telling a person what to think and how to think, right? When we show people our evidence, when we show people our reasoning, we're telling people how to think in addition to what to think, and giving them the opportunity to think something else if the evidence and reason support an alternative theory or an alternative explanation, an alternative conclusion. So, we also, in addition to discussing Ellsberg in this class, have looked at the work of this guy, John Gibson. And one of the interesting things about John Gibson is he uses a narrative paradigm in his construction of arguments. And while the narrative paradigm has many virtues and many strengths, it's got some other weaknesses too in terms of its ability to do things, right? So he tells the story of Redding, California. And in Redding, California, even though it's, 2005, they still decorate, they still put up Santa, they still put up trees, they put up bunting and wreaths, and presents all over the place. And in Redding, California, they still celebrate Christmas, right? That's the idea. But he says, hey, folks, Redding, California is the exception. It's not the rule. Christmas is under attack all over the place. Wow. That's super scary. But that's a claim that would be relatively easy for us to go out and verify, right? Okay, is Redding really the exception, or is Redding really the rule? Right? And we can figure this out. We can test this. We can go out. We can do a sample. We can set up, those of you who've studied research methods already, you know how we do this. We could go out. We set up a survey. We get a sample of towns. We got big towns, little towns, small towns, suburbs, right? We classify them. We send them out surveys, and we get back kind of like, okay, here's the kinds of here's who decorates, here's who doesn't, here's the kinds of decorations that they use, here's whether or not they're religious or non-religious or Christian or secular. We do all these kinds of things. We could actually test whether or not this claim is true. Instead, though, what we get is him saying, no, this is the exception, it's not the rule. We get his conclusion, we don't get any of his evidence. Okay, and that's a real problem. The Covington, Georgia actually shows us kind of issues related to things like punctuation and sequencing, right? How playing with punctuation and sequencing can really distort points of views and make it harder for us as the reader to process and access and understand what's really going on in a given situation, right? So, like, when you read the story, when John Gibson tells the story, he begins, right, with this guy named Goodmark. And it's really, really interesting that in a lot of students' analysis of this particular case, when they're asked to identify, like, the elements of the pentad, Goodmark is identified as the actor, right? He's the one who did something. And what was his act? He forced them to take Christmas off the calendar, right? We're going to call it a winter break, not a Christmas break. Goodmark made that happen. And why did he do it? That's not really talked about so much, but the implications that that Gibson brings to it is that Goodmark's motive is that he's trying to undermine or limit or marginalize the Christian influence in our public schools. But the fact of the matter is that there is also Tidy, right? He was an actor. He did something. And the story actually begins with the break being named Winter Break. If you go back to like the chronological origin of the story, which really takes place about the middle of the chapter in Gibson's telling, right? Okay. In this case, it was Tidy, right, who saw Winter Break, changed it to Christmas Break. All right. And the only indication that we have of why he do that, I mean, Gibson says like, well, he wasn't really blah, blah, blah. But we have Tidy on record saying that the United States is a Christian nation, and that right is part of his reasoning and thinking of why he wanted to change it to Christmas Break instead of Winter Break. Okay, now here we have an actor and act and a purpose. Well, when we're telling the story, we're making a choice here about which of those. So how do we begin by saying that the agent of action, right, the one who's actually committing the act is Goodmark, and that the act which really drives our narrative is the forcing of the word off the calendar? Tidy didn't react to that. In fact, one of these actions has to come first. Would Goodmark have ever acted if Tidy hadn't acted? No. He wouldn't have come in and said, hey, here's a letter with an injunction telling you to never ever change what is already written down as Winter Break, right? And so see, what Gibson does by starting the story in the middle, by positioning a person, right, from one perspective to another, and by kind of distorting and sublimating different aspects of the purpose, that's those ratios that we talk about when we're talking about describing arguments and describing narratives. We're talking about the ratios of act, agent, agency, scene, and ratio, right? Okay, this makes it harder, right? Now, when we put it in a proper chronological order, right, we have a guy named Tidy. He's elected to the school board. He changes this because he says it's too PC, but he goes around saying things like the United States is a Christian nation, right? Okay, and then when he gets an injunction, they're unable to fight it because of it, right? Okay, that tells a totally different kind of story. So the question that we're interested in, the question that we're always interested in, is not whether or not there is a war on Christmas, not whether or not we value Christmas, not whether or not Gibson believes it, not whether or not you believe it, not whether or not Gibson is an ethical person. Like, those really aren't matters under consideration. Like, that's topics that we can think about, but that don't really come into play when we're talking about an ethics of argument. We're saying, or I'm saying, that Gibson's argument is unethical, right? Because the narrative style that he uses makes it impossible for us to really question or challenge his data, right? That he encourages and really pushes us to kind of moral outrage and be really angry rather than into a state where we would want to reflect critically and evaluate evidence and information, right? And he has all kinds of assumptions about what America is, that he does. I mean, really, if Gibson had begun his book by saying, okay, I'm going to make the argument about why Christianity ought to be promoted and ought to be supported in public schools, but he doesn't do that, right? He kind of pushes that issue to the side and focuses in on all these other things, right? He's focusing on the smoke and the mirrors over here rather than kind of substantive issues in the argument. And I think that's another really important part of the thing that this critical theory of ethics that I'm talking about really gets us at, right? Okay, in that it doesn't just let us challenge the sources or bases of the argument, it also gives us the opportunity to challenge or question some of the assumptions of the argument, things that are part of the setting of the argument, right? Okay, like, all arguments make assumptions, and that's okay, but what are those assumptions? Are they limited assumptions? Are they reasonable assumptions? Is the argument pretty open about what is and is not being assumed? And giving the interlocutor, the other person in the argument, the opportunity to question and challenge those assumptions. And the same thing is true about the standards or basis for judging the argument, right? Okay, there's that ability of the auditor, the person that we're arguing with, to be invited in, right? To be able to say, okay, here's what I'm going to prove. Here's what you need to prove to unseat me. Here are the standards that we're going to argue from. And as an alternative, as a kind of alternate in the argument, as the interlocutor, I can respond back by saying, okay, well, I'll accept these standards, but I also think we need to consider this kind of evidence, and we need to consider this kind of information, and these are other issues that we need to be brought into. And an argument that allows for that kind of possibility of back and forth of other points of view, and that's another really important part of Gibson's argument, right? The way that he kind of talks about his opposition, the way that he silences perspective, the way he cuts off points of view by really beginning arguments in really unusual unusual and odd places, by treating things as though they're conclusive when really they're just one particular point of view. I mean, that's a really, really important limitation that he sets up on his argument that fundamentally makes it harder for us as readers and processors of his argument to become part of the argument, to engage in it ourselves. We are less able to do so. We are now more domesticated, dependent upon his sources of information. So, liberation in argument is fundamentally about making people more able and more willing to engage in critical, reflective kind of thinking and to participate in public discourse. That is what makes a good argument. So we think about not the subject matter being discussed so much as the effect of the discussion itself upon the critical capacities of the listeners and the arguers and the interlocutors. So, this critical theory of ethics that I'm talking about is a theory of ethics that focuses on relationships between arguers and audiences, also other arguers, interlocutors, etc., and looks at things in terms of their capacity to liberate over their capacity to domesticate, seeing liberation as being fundamentally good and domestication as being fundamentally bad. So, remember, when we're talking about whether or not arguments are ethical or not, ethics of argument, we're talking about a way of assessing arguments. And so in this sense, what we're talking about, what we're doing here, is about adding to our toolbox, right? Expanding on those things that we know already. And before we go, there are other things that are really important to recognize about our ethical toolbox. And these are some problems that come up in ethical criticism, things that sometimes trip us up and cause us problems. The first of these is what we call critical narcissism. Right? Critical narcissism, and remember, Narcissus, that's that myth, right, where he looks into the water and he sees himself, and he believes that he is the perfect person, and that leads him into this kind of like, he dies, right? There you go, right? And this is this tendency to see ourselves as the mythical yardstick, right? What I would do, that's what an ethical person would do, right? It's this kind of thinking, and this kind of thinking has two real serious flaws to it that we need to keep in mind. First of all, is that you're not really talking about what you would do in a given situation. You're talking about what you think you would do in a given situation, right? I always think it's fascinating when people say, like, if the Nazis rolled into town, here's what I would do, right? If they knocked on my door looking, here's what I would do. I think that's great. I think thinking about those things is kind of a mental rehearsal and prepares you to engage in those kind of activities. Awesome, right? But let's not assume that you know what you're going to do when you're faced with an ethical or moral dilemma, and that you know what kinds of choices that you're going to make. It's easy to talk about those things in the abstract, but you don't know what you're going to do until you're often really faced with those choices. The other thing that it does is it assumes that your choices and what your impulsive kinds of decisions are that you would make are also the ethical sorts of decisions. And I think that that's a really kind of, not just arrogant, but narcissistic way of approaching ethical questions. There's every bit of possibility that if you and I both walk up and encounter the same ethical situation and we disagree about what to do, the fact that you're the one who chose that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the ethical perspective, right? Any more than my choice is necessarily more ethical than yours. The fact that we have ethical disagreement means that your choices are not necessarily the ethical ones. And in fact, what that does is kind of says, hey, I'm right, I'm always right, I'm ethical, of people who disagree. And that's certainly not what I think any of us would take as a standard method of ethics, right? In addition to narcissism, the other problem that we often have in ethical criticism is what's called exceptionalism, right? Okay, and if narcissism says, I'm the measure, I'm the standard, I'm the yardstick by which we determine other people's ethics, exceptionalism is the idea that the yardstick that applies to me and the yardstick that applies to other people are different, right? That other people should be held accountable to these particular rules, but that something about me makes me exempt from those in some way. And exceptionalism is a fundamental denial of equality, which is really at the heart of argumentation theory and most theories of ethics and justice. Like, it's really, really hard to find a theory of ethics that says that there should be different sauce for the goose than for the gander, right? To use that idiom, And the idea behind this is that most ethical theories that people can come up with or brought up is the idea of reciprocity, okay, as a central component. The idea that the ethical rules that I would generate, that I would come up with, that I would wish to be applied to other people, I would also insist be applied to me, right? That the same grounds for which I would hold you accountable, I should be held accountable to. That the same things that get you, in trouble should get me in trouble. The same kind of things that say you're unethical should say I am unethical if I am doing those same things. That's the idea of reciprocity. It's a fairly central concept to almost any theory of ethics that I can think of. Whew. Lots of material here, lots of stuff that we've gone through, but what we now have here is a pretty rounded out toolbox. We've got lots of really interesting stuff here, right? We've got traditional ways of describing arguments. We've got narrative ways of describing arguments. We've got traditional ways of evaluating arguments. We've got narrative ways of evaluating arguments. And now we have ethical ways of evaluating arguments. So we have lots and lots of different ways to both talk about arguments and think about arguments, and to really begin to then kind of like develop and make our own arguments ourselves, I guess. That's kind of where we're going as we go. But thanks a lot, everyone. I really hope you learned a lot. Don't forget to do the readings. Don't forget to take the quizzes.